Are there any questions? No. Please join us in welcoming our special guest, the filmmaker Stevan Riley. So obviously the first question is, for me, is the genesis of the film and the audio tape component, which is very significant. How did it all come together for you initially?
So I was approached by a producer, John Batsek, who I've directed a couple of films for his company in the last several years. He got in touch and said, "Would you be interested in doing a film with Marlon Brando?" And it was, and I'm actually very grateful that I kind of seized that moment and said, "Yeah, I'd like to do some research on Brando," knowing that he was a very fascinating and complex character. So that was how my involvement came, was how I was first introduced to the project. But prior to that, there was R.J. Cutler, who's a director-producer out in the States.
From Long Island. He's from Long Island.
He's a local
yep.
boy. Okay, well, that's good to know. He, along with John, they'd been in touch with the estate about doing a film of any description on Brando, and so that was the ground had been prepared for a documentary. And so one of the questions which I then asked was, what have we got? Is there any archive that could be used? One of the sort of regular questions for a doc. And they said, yeah, we've got full access to what's available. But it was only by stages did it become clear about how much would be available to me. I had a selection of audio tapes, amongst all the things which were which were present at that time. If I could just to mention to you guys, it was a coincidence that right when the documentary was coming about, that the film, the archive was being unpacked. Brando had been dead for 10 years, and all of the boxes of his personal effects, including his documentation and all sorts of things, had been put in storage for all that time, and that was just coming out of boxes at the moment when the documentary was being suggested. So I, amongst the stuff which was appearing were these audio tapes. And the first ones I heard included the self-hypnosis tapes, which you hear at the beginning of the film, and a couple of other really sort of deep conversations that he was having with family members or friends of his, which were really sort of informed me to make me think, my God, this is some really deep personal content here. What if Brando could tell the entire story in his own words? And that was an ambition at that point, just really a thought on my part, if that would ever be possible. But I went out to America, researched the film in terms of meeting his family members, friends, work colleagues, fellow actors, staff, just to research it in case I needed interviews for the film. Because I wasn't sure I could actually deliver on that first idea. But it was interesting that the more I got embroiled in interviewing them and finding out about Brando, things got clearer but also more complicated. And that his life was very separate, and he had separate friendships and separate relationships, and it wasn't always very. There weren't a set of people who could tell his entire life story, I felt. So it just led me more into believing that the original plan was just ever more important, and to get Brando to tell it all in his own words. And coincidentally, more tapes were coming out of the boxes, and the transcriptions were piling up higher and higher and higher. And in the end, I had about a good several feet, 12 thick folders of these transcriptions from which I could formulate the script and start delivering on this idea.
Don't you love when people from England say that I came to America? Love when they call it America. You wanted me to do the accent for you.
Yeah.
There it is. Well, we just had dinner together. So, but what was your understanding of, relationship with, appreciation of, whatever you want to fill in, of Brando prior to this, and what changed through the process of making the film?
Do you know, I really didn't know anything at all about Marlon Brando. You know, I'll be honest. You know, that was. I mean, I had you know, some vague idea. You know, I guess the sort of things which maybe a lot of you guys had your own impressions or knowledge when you first came in tonight. I knew that. I mean, I knew he was the icon. I knew he was the big actor. He was responsible, you know, and starred in all the films. You know, many of my favourites: Godfather, Last Tango. You know, Apocalypse Now. Those are my favourites as a kid growing up. But I also then knew, you know, I knew he put on a load of weight. That he, you know, didn't he, you know, ferret himself away. He was the recluse, and I knew he was you know, potentially a troubled man. And there was some terrible tragedy that had taken place in his household, hadn't there? You know, I mean, these were things which I knew, and I tried to keep a hold on that and try to remember that. Just for the sake of people who didn't know anything about Brando, a new generation of you know, youngsters who weren't aware of his legacy. I just tried to, you know, just remember how I felt when I first came in, just so I could just help ease other people into the film. But the rest of it was just, you know, to just all research and a real voyage of discovery. And
what for you personally did you discover? What did you think of him?
Do you know, I mean,
during and after the process?
Well, I mean, it was difficult, and I must admit, I was really in two minds, because I thought, you know, actually, who is this guy? You know, I can't figure him out. He seems to embody all these contradictions at the same time, and actually, is he one or not? And then part of you wants to, I think a natural inclination is we want to categorize, and I wanted him to be somebody who I could understand and fathom. But actually, what I came to develop a knowledge of was those contradictions, and realizing how they could coexist, and how he could still be a complete individual, and how there could be it could still be coherent, his character. And and I got to know him and eventually like him. And that was actually, that was my biggest discovery and enjoyment in the piece, was actually, you know, because he had lots of character flaws, and many, but, you know, you hear him talking about them. And I just found his honesty, his entire approach to, you know, his own problems and, you know, and human behaviour as
were there tapes you I'm sorry to ask this question, but like, were there tapes you heard and you listened to them, and then the people from the estate were like, no, you shouldn't listen to those tapes, don't listen to those tapes?
Do you know, I mean, this was with total honesty now, no, there was none of that. And in some respects, I was quite surprised.
He wasn't having phone sex with someone and recording it.
I mean,
that'd be thrilling, wouldn't it? Marlon Brando having phone sex.
I mean, there was some racy stuff. There was. I mean, there was.
But there had to be. There had to be.
There was all sorts of. I mean, it was amazing. Everything just like came my way, and I was the first to listen to it, you know, in its entirety. And
you can just imagine Brando.
What are you wearing right now? What are you wearing?
There was none of
that. There was. It was a little bit huskier when he was doing it, actually. But
so there was some weirdness in there.
Well, no, it was never that weird. It was all human. It was all kind of like, you know, it was all moments which we'd all have. I mean, if anything, it was just a, you know, I was very aware of how intrusive the process was. You know, here I was. This is a guy. I know he's very private. He's, you know, this is potentially his absolute worst nightmare, and it would be for all of us. Can you imagine if someone's like going through all your personal effects and all your private stuff, and just and nosing through and and making conclusions about you? I mean, what a horrid thought. And I don't think he'd ever have. Listen, I don't think he'd ever have endorsed it. You know, the project. He was very suspicious of editors. You know, he really was very wary. He knew that when you cut two things together, two separate things, juxtapose them, you create an entirely new idea. I mean, that's the edit. You know, so how do you ever try? I mean, documentary is almost a misnomer. I don't think a documentary is a true form, and everyone sort of goes, well, if it's documentary, it must be truth. I think you always strive towards the truth, but you're always battling with myth, and you're struggling. You're always face to face with that, and that was the thing I learned a lot from Marlon. Was, I mean, he saw myths everywhere. Almost to the point of just like absolutely reality collapsed and truth collapsed in the presence of myths of the family, myths of America, myths of cinema, myths of Marlon Brando. You know, you're doing well if you would get anywhere near the truth. And documentaries are a similar thing. So it's quite nice to go to more stream of consciousness here and try to access memory. And I wanted to like edit the film as almost like a thoughtscape and a memoryscape of Marlon, where you could jump the timeline, you could switch thoughts on the back of an emotion or an insecurity as well as a fact, and create something a bit more poetic and impressionistic that by within its entirety might encompass some of the truth, you know. But you can't be too completist.
Did you have a question?
Yeah, no, I mean, now that you've really dug into Marlon Brando as a subject, if someone who wasn't not familiar with him said what three Marlon Brando performances really embody who I now know him to be, or as much as you can, what would you recommend someone see?
Do you know, this might sound like a dodge of that question, but you know, the thing with Marlon is that he was so forceful when it came to imposing himself on a character and imposing himself on a script, even when the script, you know, was a gift for him in terms of money, when he was short of money, you know, when he needed the work and he had to work, he would still find a way to impose himself on it, find some access the material or redevelop the material to include a message that he wanted. He often wanted a message, and I'd probably say always wanted a message in a movie, even the more silly ones. And so there's, you know, in answer to that, there's something of Marlon in every film, you know, as you'd expect. I mean, you know, life and art were working in tandem. But I don't know. I mean, look, the one he directed was One-Eyed Jacks. That's a film that Marlon, you see, there's a brief clip of it where he's by the water, by the ocean waves. I don't know if you remember that, but there's a moment in the film where that's the film that he directed himself. Sitting on the rocks. Apparently, it's famed in Hollywood.
They waited like 3 days.
Waited 3 days. To get for the weather to kick up and for the waves to be as they were. But it's a great shot. He was right. I mean, I think maybe maybe it's bad budgeting, but he got the shot. You know, it was a great shot, but he knew what he wanted, and that happens to be Martin Scorsese's favorite Western. It's also Tarantino's favorite Western, and Brando directed that, so it's quite interesting to know. You know, he had real talent as a writer and a director. His favorite film, which is probably should be in the three, is Burn. Which is a film that was directed by Gio Pontecorvo, and it's all about it's all about colonialism and the rapacious, you know, just the capitalist aspects of that, which I think the film's from the 18th century, actually. It's set in the late 18th century, and race issues, all the stuff that he was interested in. And then, what else?
Do you think that's his favorite film because he thinks as an artistic achievement it was great, or because it is in line with his politics?
Both. That was it. It married the two. It had artistic sensibility and it had political message as well. So that's probably why he was in love with it. But it was buried. He felt there wasn't the marketing. It was, you know, it didn't have the push it should have done. So I imagine a lot of people, you guys haven't seen it. But and then the third one, dear me, I don't know. I was trying to think what might have resonated with him. I mean, Streetcar, you know, you can see it was Streetcar in terms of, you know, him as a character. He always wanted to get away from being Stanley Kowalski. You heard that, you know, when the press popularized him as Stanley Kowalski, that was his worst nightmare as well, because, you know, he was reenacting his childhood and his dad. It was like it's like telling him you're your father. But, you know, as you see by the end of the documentary, you know, he's got closer to a realization that you can't escape your upbringing, you can't escape your parents, and you become your parents whether you like it or not.
We were talking over dinner about how the thing about Brando to me that is the opportunity that meets the gifts that he had is to make a film with someone like Kazan, because it's almost impossible to make a great film. You can give a good performance, even a great performance, in a mediocre film, and it just doesn't have the same effect. And to couple with someone like Kazan, who we were saying before about how, you know, Brando would go into rehearsals and he would go on into the theater and do nothing of what he was told to do. And you know, there's like 5 people in the room who are saying, "Who is this guy? We got to fire him. You know, this guy's terrible." And Kazan was the one person in the room who would say, "Just wait, and give it a few more minutes," and then all of a sudden this, you know, supernova would occur in which Brando would just combust into something that very few people had seen, and, you know, that realistically in the 40s in the theater in the United States. You know, Jessica Tandy, I did Streetcar in 1992, and this woman who was the executor of the Brando estate, Maria St. Just, and she said to me, Jessica Tandy would come off stage in the 1947 production, and she didn't want to go back on stage. she was really scared of him. She thought he was going to pick her up and throw her right through the wall, you know. And she was just didn't know what was going to happen. And my point is that that's such a great thing. Brando is Brando because he put all the pieces together while he still had the intense sheen of real youth. He was so young. The joke in acting is by the time you figure out how to play Hamlet, you're too old to play Hamlet. You know, you're 40. And for Brando, it was like a Rubik's Cube, but he just whipped it together in like 5 seconds. And he was like, "You mean like this?" And he would show people things as an actor. There were these virtuosic moments that people were unprepared for in a guy in his mid-20s. He was 24 when he did Streetcar. But a lot of that is to be with a great director, I think. You know, Kazan was somebody who, he's so lucky he worked with Kazan, who was the guy in the room that protected him. You know, it's like these batteries you see between Scorsese and De Niro, and now Scorsese with Leo, and you know, somebody who's really going to protect you creatively, and they're going to figure out how to take that thing you do with a multitude of things you can do, and they're really going to serve it up at the right way and the right temperature and everything. It's a great director. Some of these legends, might not have been able to become that if it weren't for a great director. I have one more question. We don't want to run too late here, but we'll take some questions. But I have one more question, which is, we talked over dinner how I met Brando in 1999 because I was trying to convince him to do a television film with me. And oddly enough, in the Williams canon, we were going to do Cat on a Hot Tin Roof for TV. And he was going to play Big Daddy, but they wouldn't insure him because of his health. He was very unhealthy. This is just a few years before he died. And yet when you see Brando in person, when you meet him, he was this incredibly tender guy. You know, he was this incredibly tender guy. And when I see this film, what I see, because I'm a huge Brando-phile, is that this is a guy who, as you often see in this business, is his income had collapsed at a time when he most needed money. You know, he had like 50 children, you know, with like every housekeeper who ever worked in his house, he had a kid with or something. And correct? He had a lot of children.
Quite a few, yeah.
Quite a few children with on that special program he had. And one of the benefits of working with him, I guess, is you get a baby in the deal. And but legal fees and all the torment of his daughter, and you're going to see in this film. And I love how you really took your time with that, because a lot of people would have said, "Oh, that's indulgent," or "That's melodramatic," or whatever. But to see this man, like any man, to watch him suffer about his daughter dying, you know, and then the way she died, and the montage you did of this girl who's she's like a gemstone, you know, she's this incredibly, exquisitely beautiful girl, Cheyenne Brando, and I just thought that was a really beautiful section of the film you had there about, you know, what really, I think, ultimately did him in, you know, was his kid, to have your kid, as they say, predecease you was just a horrible thing, and but Brando. You see him toward the end of his life, where it's like he doesn't have any money, so he's going to do anything to make money. Like he had all these crazy schemes to make money. He had all these crazy ideas. He'd have people come over and he'd pitch them these ideas for get-rich-quick schemes that he had, because he knew he couldn't work, you know, that much. He had become morbidly obese and he was very unhealthy, and all this was happening right when he needed money most of all. He was like really, really pretty broke. And but I think when you see this film, you see, and I wonder how you feel about this. Like, you see, like, what does someone love? That's how you define them. What do they love? What's the thing or the person or the persons that they love? And I was wondering what impression you got from him. What did he love more? Did he love his family more? Did he love acting more? Did he love art more? I mean, because he pretended he didn't love acting, and that's not true. I think he really did love acting. And I think that was the great lie that Brando perpetrated, was how much he downplayed his affection for acting and for performing. Because we talked about over dinner how he was from that putty on the nose school, like Alec Guinness and Olivier and Tea House and putting the stuff in his mouth for The Godfather. He loved to put on the mask. You know what I mean? He didn't want to just do the naturalistic thing, which some people do brilliantly. I mean, Nicholson shows up, and he's almost always Nicholson, you know, and he's had one of the greatest film careers ever. But Brando was somebody who, I think he was a lot like the Brits. You know, he wanted to change himself and transform himself and get into this role, the external and the voice, like Dustin Hoffman does a lot of and so forth. But I was wondering, what do you think he loved? What do you think was the thing he loved most?
Well, I thought it was interesting, the time you talk about when he was chasing money and he was running out of cash and he had a lot of dependents and he had a lot of overheads in terms of, you know, the people he had gathered around him and properties he had for them, and there was many outgoings. After his daughter's suicide in '95, so this is a good 10 years before he passed away, he never went back to Tahiti. Because she committed suicide there, and I always sort of wondered, you know, why he didn't sell Tahiti, you know, to cover those costs you're talking about, because he was wasn't just an island, it wasn't small, it was a whole entire archipelago. It was a whole massive series of islands. I mean, God knows what it was worth even then, but he kept on to it, even though he never went back. I didn't know whether it was like, you know, just whether it was, you know, just a memory of this place that he wanted to keep alive. He didn't want to relinquish ownership of it. I mean, that was his sanctuary. That was a place he was in love with. That was a place that was a source of peace, genuine peace for him, and his hideaway entirely. He loved his family. I mean, no doubt about that. He definitely did, and all of the kids say that, and that he was was a very loving father. But I think, by his own admission, he was an absent father too. You know, he would love, even when the kids were present, he wasn't always there. Like, he'd get all the kids around, and they'd be around in his household, and they'd be playing in his pool and Jack Nicholson's pool, who was a neighbour, and they'd all be, you know, everyone was around. He could hear them outside his window, but he was inside. He might be inside his bedroom doing his stuff and doing his work. It was enough to hear their voices and then gather for a dinner. But, you know, he wasn't always. I mean, I'm presuming a bit here, but, you know, I just think that, you know, he could have. I think that might have been his regret, you know, because he knew what bad parenting was, because he grew up with it. So I think he might have punished himself all the more when he felt that he'd been a bad parent too, because that was everything he tried to avoid. But he did love his family. I mean, I think that's
He's also one of those guys to me who he comes across as someone who, what he really craved most of all was for people to accept him as he was, and that was enough. You know, to go into the world and to succeed very young, and you're beautiful, and you're, you know, this. I mean, who burned brighter than Brando in the earliest stages of his career? No one really, physically beautiful and so forth, and all the things that we always say actors need to have. You know, and with male actors, it's, you know, masculinity, intelligence, and sensitivity. If you can put those three things together, and Brando had all of that in spades. And yet you go into the world and you go from, you know, where he grows up in the Midwest, and you go to New York, and then you go to Hollywood, and you're among all these sophisticates. And what you really crave most of all is just a place where you can feel safe and feel loved just for who you are, not for who people think you are. I think Brando was always trying to get back to that place of being around people who genuinely loved him for who he was, just in his natural state, none of the fame and the glitter attached. Do we have any questions in the audience? We have microphones here. Yeah, we have a microphone. Do we have anybody? Where, do we see someone? Where?
One mic here, one mic there.
Yeah, do we have any questions, anyone? Right down here in front. Yeah.
You made so many fast cuts, and then you did, you know, slow down and spend a little time on some issues. But one that I was particularly taken with was the scene of the priest giving the soldier communion, and the talk behind it was about the destruction of all the mythologies. And I was struck by how long you stuck with that one. Were you making a particular religious statement yourself?
In terms of that one image and the long push in on that.
Yes.
I suppose because actually it was probably no more complicated than the fact that I wanted to keep it live and on screen for the duration of what he was saying, and I thought that image embodied that for that moment. I mean, Marlon was very prepossessed with this idea of myth, and it, as I said, you know, it just, I think it really consumed him. But partly because he was the target of myth himself. But, you know, when it came to that, yeah, he just said, you know, how I mean, you know, that might have been a real bitter pill for anyone else to swallow, especially people who, you know, who had had, you know, is it?
Seemed to turn around his idea of his acceptance of mythology. At the end, he said, we need them. At the end of his life, you have a text that says, we need these myths. We have to have them. He was trying to discard them earlier.
Well, I think it's about discriminating between what myths, are worth holding on to and what aren't. If myths provide some sort of consolation and entertainment or aspiration, say, he would, and this goes right back to his early ambition with theatre and group theatre and cinema, truth. If you can represent truth, it's not the truth. If you can represent truth in cinema, and if people feel that it's true, then you might actually motivate behaviour and change behaviour, and actually an art will serve a purpose. So, so actually in the right hands, with the right application and the right execution, yes, myth is worthwhile, but be careful, about myth, because myth is, it can send you off on all sorts of destructive routes. So just know the difference. That's what he was saying.
Hi, I love the film, and you definitely brought a more eye to Marlon Brando that I had. In the film, you had a piece where it said that could there have been an Elvis without Brando? What do you believe on that?
I thought that was really interesting, actually, because I think that Brando was the original rebel, and like he said, he was that was him. He was rebelling for the sake of rebelling. He was a guy. I remember I was very lucky with a few quotes which I put on Post-its on my edit screen when I was editing it. And there was, once he said that, that three things defined him. One was a sense of inferiority, which you hear him describe, but and ascribes to his father. Another was resistance to authority, which again might have been due to the father figure, and then last was the inability to trust, which I think went down to his relationships with women and his mother. If you're going to be really Freudian about all three, I think that. And sorry, forgive me. Can you just remind me of what your remark was? But
Elvis without.
Could there be an Elvis? Sorry. I think that that Brando was, he was rebellious in an independent for all these reasons. I think he built his own personality. He didn't rely upon the mother figure, the father figure. He craved their attention but didn't get it. So he was just anti-authority. He was the loner in many ways. He was the leading man in his own life. And he was the vulnerable leading man in his own life. So he brought all that to the fore, and he was the first expression of that. I mean, leading men traditionally were just all powerful. They didn't have flaws, but he managed to bring that in, and suddenly leading men were someone that we could all really relate to. Even the geeks and the nerds found an idol in Brando.
That's always one question I wish I could have found out was, who did Brando admire? Who were film stars from his own youth did he look back upon, the Gables and the Spencer Tracy's? Who did he admire, and who, or even among his peers, which I doubt there were many, did he admire? Do we have another question somewhere? Right over here, this gentleman right here. We have a microphone here for you.
Amazing film, and something that interests me was you always glance back to the self-hypnosis tapes, and did that have something to do with the title, Listen to Me, Marlon?
It did, actually. I made a bit of a sort of garbled intro at the beginning about how the thing came about, because there was a few things all combining. But, as one of the first tapes I listened to within this small selection of tapes initially was a self-hypnosis tape. And I was fascinated by actually, first thing when I heard it was like, wow, I mean, this is really private. This is Marlon talking to himself. Because I was trying to figure it out, what's going on here, and I suddenly realised this is a self-hypnosis tape, and he was addressing himself, and I found it fascinating the way he addressed himself. He said, "Marlon, this is a voice you can trust. This is a voice you can trust," and it was almost like he was the only voice that he felt he could actually trust, and that was himself. It's like real sort of a proper Cartesian, dead end that you get to, and that sort of refrain of Marlon, listen to my voice, it just became Listen to Me, Marlon. So I put that on my initial proposal, and just had it like that, and then everyone sort of fell in. Everyone really liked the title, and I was trying to find a better one, and I couldn't, so I stuck with that.
We have time for a couple more quick ones. What do we have over here in the corner of this?
Yeah, my question is, at what point do you think Marlon was broken? A few years ago, or many years ago, I had a conversation with Bud Schulberg, who wrote the screenplay for On the Waterfront, and he felt that the secret of Marlon was that Marlon was far and above beyond everybody else. He's way ahead of you, and people, directors, couldn't understand that. That he's more in the now than they'll ever be, and that he took Kazan and he took Bud Schulzberg's script and he led them like a rocket ship into a great movie in On the Waterfront. But it seems in your movie, and I really feel in life, Brando was at some point broken. Was it because he needed the money? I mean, he sort of gave up that rebellion, except for maybe in the Apocalypse Now movie. Am I wrong, or what do you think?
Do you know what's interesting is there were these big rises and dips in his enthusiasm. The idealism of his youth. Maybe reaching its nadir at points like Beauty on the Bounty. Or again, I mean, there were many films where he kind of got disillusioned or lost interest. But Brando could sort of switch within any one day. He could wake up full of optimism, and well springs of optimism, as he'd call them. And by the end of the day, you could be, just utterly, cynical and gutted, which is true for all of us. You all have those swings and roundabouts. They weren't necessarily these big phases of his life, although he might have felt more disillusioned within certain years.
But I also think in the film you see that the custody battle for his son, you see Brando start to change there, I think. You see him a little more, he becomes angrier and angrier in the press. I mean, when you're in the public eye and it's all Oscars and you're the greatest actor that ever lived, and they mean it. Remember, we live in show business, 80% of it is bullshit. We say this is great and this is great, and if everything's great, then nothing is great. And with Brando, he was someone who truly, they said these superlative things about him, and they meant it, and he really deserved it. And then when that changes, when you're up there on that plateau and that changes, and people start to talk about your personal life, and then the son eventually becomes guilty of a crime, he kills the brother-in-law. I mean, for Brando, it becomes, the bill comes due. Here's a man that goes off and puts his career first and his life and all that, and being Brando first, and then all of a sudden everything comes back to roost in terms of just the kind of misery of his personal life. We have time for one more, but we have a woman. Well. Here's a woman. The woman. Lay it on me.
Hi. First of all, it's a fantastic film. Enjoyed it very much. But I'm curious about his refusal of the Oscar. And I was fairly young at the time, but I remember it very well. And I was wondering, was there a backlash from Hollywood or from the Academy, and did that affect his roles over the next few years? Because I know there was very mixed feelings. You can see from the audience, people started to boo and clap, and it was kind of a, so it was there. How it affected his career at that, immediately following that.
Well, there was. I know that in the aftermath of Marlon's death, that people felt he should have had a much bigger celebration by the Academy. That there was. I mean, people have sort of said that they didn't. The tribute after Marlon died was very as big as it could have been. And who's to say? Maybe the Academy felt that justified in that, or there was. I don't think he was the favourite really. I mean, that was the industry ceremony. That was the industry's sort of precious. Right that he interfered with. So it didn't do his career any good. It was potentially career suicide. It just reinforced the idea that he was difficult and he could be difficult. But I think if you've got to make a basic choice. Because some people said, "Oh, here's Brando just trying to get attention for himself," but that's. As we probably can guess, that's the last thing you would ever try to do. So what you're left with is basically something more genuine, that he really felt that should have been brought to people's attention. And I found it interesting, him justifying that privately, when he just said that, the real mark of a civilized nation is when you can actually look upon your history in an honest fashion, and you don't ignore those things. You confront them head on, and you prove your civilization, that you can actually advance from that. And I think it was a really noble ambition on his part. And I think it was actually, it's important that he brought that to people's attention and shone a light on hypocrisy, because there's no truth there.
But I also think that Brando, the Brando that they bestow the Oscar on the second time, is a completely different Brando. I mean, I've heard stories. I mean, I can think of 2 actors I know who were famous film stars, who achieved the zenith of their film stardom, and then turn around and say, fuck you to Hollywood every way they can. They move to New York, they keep everything at arm's length, and their careers dissipate, and they can't get a job, and they start to turn a corner age-wise, and they go running out to Beverly Hills and buy a house and attend every bar mitzvah and every bat mitzvah of every agent and producer and studio head. I mean, I'm joking, but it's like they go out there, they go to every party, every fundraiser. They go out there and they want it back. And Brando had an Oscar, and he had fame, and he had acclaim, and he was at the height of his game. And then that goes away, and you act like, and you sound like, and you advertise to people that you don't care, but you do care, because life is a hell of a lot easier when you're on top than when you're not on top. And so that Brando what I think happened to Brando when he won the Oscar for The Godfather is, yes, he kind of double dips. He wants to bring attention to this cause, but at the same time, he wants to say, oh, you like me again? For the entire decade of the 60s, you wanted nothing to do with me, and you wouldn't give me a job, and you want to pay me any money, and now all of a sudden you think I'm talented again, you want to give me this award, and you want to celebrate me again. He wasn't going to buy into it again. He was never going to buy into it again. Even though he wanted to. I mean, he wanted the accoutrement of stardom, but he didn't really feel like having to service that too much. We could go on, but I don't want Ruth Appelhoff calling me in the morning and yelling at me. So, no, I'm teasing. So, please join me in welcoming our special guest. And I think you made a great film. Remember that on the 28th, we have Peace Officer, and the festival begins October 8th. October 8th. Thank you all for coming, and good night. Thank you.